The rain lashed against the pavement of downtown Clarendon, creating rivulets that curled like fingers around the steel legs of the city's skyscrapers. The evening air was thick with tension, as if the storm had stirred up more than just water and wind. Down in the basement of the old town hall, the clamor of the outside world faded into a muffled cacophony. Here, cloaked in shadows and flickering fluorescent lights, the wheels of justice turned slowly. Detective Sarah Lewis stood outside the courtroom door, her heart racing. She adjusted her collar and wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead, cursing the humid air. Today would decide the fate of her case, a case that had consumed her every waking moment for the past 6 months. The stakes were high. She wasn't just fighting for a conviction but for the very lives shattered by the crime. Inside the courtroom, voices rose and fell like restless waves. Richard Calloway sat at the defendant's table, radiating an air of arrogance that made her stomach churn. He was a man built on wealth and privilege, but today he wore his confidence like a shield against the gathering storm of accusations. His tailored suit hugged his frame, the soft blue contrasting starkly with the grim expressions of the victims' families seated behind him. As the judge entered, the noises subsided. The honorific title, Judge Eleanor Whitmore, resonated through the chamber, imbuing it with a reverence that was both comforting and intimidating. Sarah watched as the judge's gaze scanned the room, landing momentarily on Richard. He smiled back at her, a grin that dripped with disdain. Sarah gripped the folder of evidence tightly against her chest, knuckles turning white. Each victim's story was etched in her mind, the desperate pleas of Angela Foster as she recounted losing her home, the haunting eyes of Thomas Hale when he spoke of the life he'd built only to see it crumble. Their pain fueled her desire for justice, and she would not let Richard's arrogance undermine that. The trial unfolded with painstaking precision, the prosecution laying out evidence piece by piece. Emails surfaced, shocking snippets where Richard had directed his team to falsify financial documents. Between testimonies, Sarah felt rage boiling within her. She could see the hurt in the family's eyes, the longing for closure clashing against the coldness radiating from Richard. Business is business, he'd sneered when confronted with damning evidence. You wouldn't understand? The anger in the courtroom simmered, turning the air electric. But no one more than Sarah. She kept her focus, drawing strength from the courage of those who had suffered due to Richard's greed. When Angela Foster took the witness stand, the courtroom fell silent. The once vibrant woman now trembled like a sapling battered by the wind. "I trusted you," she managed to state, her voice a fragile whisper. "You took everything from me." Richard didn't flinch, his eyes glinting with a mix of contempt and amusement. It was as if the pain of others fed his ego. But today, Sarah was determined to make him face those he had hurt. "Mr. Calloway," Sarah shouted, unable to contain herself any longer, her frustration bubbling over. "Do you understand the lives you've destroyed?" For the first time, Richard's smirk wavered, and a flicker of surprise danced across his features. The courtroom's tension thickened, nearly crackling in the air. Judge Whitmore's gavel came down hard, demanding order. "Detective Lewis, this is not the time for theatrics. Focus on the facts." Breathing heavily, Sarah nodded, shaking off the rush of emotions. She reviewed the evidence before her, knowing that the weight of the case rested on her shoulders. Then, everything shifted. The witness door swung open, drawing Sarah's gaze. A figure stepped inside, rain-soaked and breathless. It was someone she had never expected to see. A childhood friend, the last person she thought would revisit her life now, in this tumultuous moment. "Sarah?" The voice was shaky but determined. All eyes turned to the newcomer as the electricity of the courtroom intensified. Gasps echoed softly. The woman was no longer a child. She was an adult, bearing the scars of a shared past, someone who could tip the scales of justice in an unforeseen direction. "Please," her friend continued, stepping closer, "I know more than you think." The unexpected twist sent ripples of disbelief through the room, an alarm that something deeper was about to unravel. In that moment, Sarah knew this trial would not just decide Richard's fate, it would unearth secrets long buried. Sarah's mind flashed back to their childhood days spent playing in the woods behind their houses. They had been inseparable, sharing secrets and dreams that only they knew about. But as they grew older, their paths diverged, and they lost touch. Now, as she looked at her friend standing before her, Sarah felt a mix of emotions: guilt for not staying in touch, relief that her friend was there now to support her in this critical moment. "What do you mean you know more?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her friend hesitated before speaking in a hushed tone. "I know about your sister's disappearance." Sarah's eyes widened in shock. Her sister's disappearance had been a case that had haunted Sarah for years, a case that she had given up hope would ever be solved. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked again, this time with a hint of desperation creeping into her voice. Her friend took a deep breath before speaking in a steady tone. "I was there that night. I saw what happened." Sarah's world came crashing down around her as she stared at her friend in stunned silence. The courtroom erupted into chaos as news of this revelation spread like wildfire. People shouted questions and accusations, and it seemed like time itself had come to a standstill. Sarah felt like she was drowning in a sea of emotions: shock, anger, sadness, and she didn't know how to process it all. But as she looked at her friend standing before her, she knew one thing for sure: she would not let this revelation be buried like so many other secrets in this city. She would make sure that justice was served for her sister and for all those who had suffered at Richard's hands, and so began a new chapter in Sarah's life. A chapter marked by determination and courage as she faced off against Richard Calloway once again. This time, however, it wouldn't just be about winning or losing, it would be about uncovering the truth and bringing closure to those who had been hurt by his actions. Sarah steeled herself for what lay ahead. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to face whatever challenges came her way. For herself, for her sister, for justice. The battle was far from over. But one thing was certain: Sarah Lewis would not back down. Not now. Not ever. The courtroom buzzed with an electric tension as Sarah stood frozen in place, grappling with the storm of emotions that flooded her system. The judge's gavel echoed through the chamber, attempting to restore order among the chaos, but Sarah felt as if she were swimming under an ocean of revelation, desperately struggling to breathe. "Sarah." A voice broke through the noise. It was her friend, Clara, stepping closer. "I can explain everything." With her heart pounding like a drum, Sarah held her gaze steady. Clara's appearance was both a comfort and a complication. She was the last person Sarah had expected to see. They had grown apart after high school, the distance between them filled with unspoken words and unresolved issues. "Let's step outside," Sarah said, her voice tinged with urgency. As Clara nodded, they slipped out of the courtroom into a narrow hallway, the hum of voices fading behind them. The air felt dense, filled with unvoiced anxieties and unburdened truths. Sarah leaned against the wall, her mind racing. "You saw my sister that night," she stated, the gravity of her friend's revelation weighing heavily between them. Clara took a steadying breath. "I didn't want to tell you before, Sarah. I thought I could forget it, erase it from my memory, but I was lying to myself." "You need to start from the beginning," Sarah demanded, her voice sharp but trembling. "What did you see?" Clara rubbed her palms nervously against her jeans, her eyes darting around as if the shadows held answers. "Your sister and I went to that party, you know, the one Richard threw. It was supposed to be fun, a break from everything, but it turned chaotic so quickly. In that hallway, memories began to seep back into Sarah's consciousness like vivid snapshots. She remembered the nights they'd spent laughing and dreaming, carefree moments overshadowed by her sister's tragic fate. Was she happy? Did she seem all right before everything happened? Clara's expression darkened. Something changed. It was subtle at first. She wanted to leave, but I urged her to stay. "I didn't realize what I was doing, Sarah. I was being selfish." "Selfish," Sarah echoed, an edge of bitterness creeping into her tone. "You were supposed to be her friend." I know. Clara cried, her voice laced with desperation. "But then we saw Richard. He was charming, persuasive, and she liked the attention. I thought it was harmless." "Harmless?" Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry. I thought he was just being his typical sleazy self at first. But then I saw him pull her aside. I didn't think there was anything wrong until it was too late. I went looking for her but couldn't find them. I heard her scream, Sarah. The memories rushed back like a torrent, drowning Sarah in despair. You heard her scream? Why didn't you call for help? Why didn't you tell anyone? Clara's face fell. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. Richard was powerful and connected. I thought if I said anything, it would ruin my life. I never imagined it could lead to this. As Clara spoke, a mixture of guilt and anger swirled within Sarah. Years of silence had burdened Clara just as much as the heartache had consumed her. Your fear didn't mean my sister's life was any less valuable, Sarah replied, her voice closing with all the pain she had felt through the years. You were there. You let him. I know I did, Sarah. And I'm so sorry, Clara cried, her voice cracking. I've lived with this every day since. When you started this investigation, I was terrified you'd find me, because I felt so guilty. Seeing you at the forefront of this fight. I wanted to help, but I couldn't muster the courage. You should have had more courage, Sarah snapped, but beneath her anger was an aching need to understand. No longer could Sarah ignore the years spent searching for answers, the empty spaces in her heart where her sister's laughter once rang bright. Clara's presence had awakened shadows that had long been suppressed. Was it Richard? Sarah finally asked, her voice trembling. Did he hurt her? Clara's lips quivered as tears spilled down her cheeks. I don't know for sure. I didn't stay to find out. I ran and never looked back, but I've faced those demons every single day since. The guilt has haunted me. The weight of her friend's confession sat heavily between them, but as Sarah sought clarity, the truth was slowly crystallizing in her mind. You need to tell the court what you saw. This could change everything, Sarah urged. Clara shook her head vehemently, fear flooding her expression. I can't. What if he retaliates? He has connections, Sarah. You don't know what he's capable of. He can't keep hiding and we can't let him walk away. You have to come forward. This isn't just about us anymore. Sarah's voice softened. It's about justice for everyone he's hurt. Please. The hallway was silent, and the weight of their history hung in the air. At last, Clara nodded, her determination rediscovered. You're right. I'll do it. Just then, the courtroom door creaked open, and a figure loomed in the threshold, Richard Calloway, flanked by his smug legal team. The arrogance in his stance drew a collective gasp from the few stragglers remaining in the hallway. The light poured from the courtroom behind him, casting him in an imposing silhouette. What are you doing out here, ladies? He addressed them with a sneer, his tone laced with condescension. Caught in a snare of sordid gossip? You should be inside, where the real trial is happening. The contempt in his voice sent a bolt of fury through Sarah. This isn't over, Calloway, she shouted, feeling Clara's anxiety spike beside her. Richard merely smirked. What's this? A secret? You think you can play the investigative savior? Not a chance. I have more power than you realize. As he strode past them, Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline. They were on the edge of something monumental, something that could potentially unravel his entire empire. Don't let him intimidate you, Sarah whispered to Clara. We will confront this together. You're not alone. With newfound resolve, Clara nodded, steeling herself against Richard's daunting presence. They exchanged a determined glance, an unspoken bond forged in the fires of their past. In that moment, a flicker of hope ignited within Sarah, hope that the truth would rise, that justice would prevail, and that they would both find the closure they desperately needed. As they turned back toward the courtroom, the specter of Richard loomed large behind them. But Sarah could sense that the tides were shifting. Together, they would face the reckoning that awaited them inside, the truth ready to shatter the illusion of power and control that Richard had held for far too long. The journey ahead would not be without its trials, but Sarah knew one thing for certain: she would not back down. Not now, not ever. Together, they would fight for justice, unearthing decades-old secrets, turning whispers into roars, until the truth was laid bare for all to. As Sarah and Clara stepped back into the courtroom, the atmosphere was markedly different from before. No longer just a place of whispers and accusations, It felt like a battleground where truth and deception faced off in a public spectacle. As they took their seats, Sarah felt a twinge of anxiety mixed with determination, a potent cocktail that fueled her resolve. The judge rapped the gavel, calling the court to order. She could see Richard seated at the front, his demeanor calm and calculating, like a predator in light-colored designer attire. A knot formed in Sarah's stomach as she remembered Clara's revelations. Turning back now felt impossible. "Miss Clara Thompson, please step forward," the judge commanded. As Clara stood to approach the stand, Sarah squeezed her hand in a silent show of support. Clara's face paled slightly, but she took a deep breath and proceeded to the witness box. The room's air seemed to grow heavier with anticipation, every eye trained on her, waiting for the storm of secrets to break loose. "Can you please state your full name for the record?" the prosecutor asked, breaking the tension. "Clara Thompson," she answered, her voice wavering but steady. "Miss Thompson, you were present at the party hosted by Richard Calloway on the night of Sarah's sister's disappearance. Can you recount your experience?" Clara's eyes darted towards Sarah briefly, and then she nodded, anchoring herself in the moment. "Yes. I went with Sarah's sister, and we were supposed to enjoy ourselves. But things took a darker turn." The prosecutor leaned in, urging, "Please, go on." "I saw Richard talking to her. It seemed harmless at first," Clara continued. "But then they moved to a private area, and I started to worry." She hesitated, and Sarah held her breath, desperate for Clara to find the strength to continue. "I wanted to check on her, but I was afraid of Richard, and I was also caught up in my own foolishness. The party was wild, and I thought I was overreacting." "Can you tell the court what you heard?" the prosecutor pressed gently. Clara's voice trembled with emotion. "I heard her scream. I ran, but by the time I got to where they had been, he was gone, and so was she. I didn't see what happened, but I felt it. I felt the darkness that surrounded him." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline as she observed Richard's face tightening, the haughty confidence evaporating beneath the weight of Clara's words. "Did you see him touch her?" the prosecutor inquired. "No," Clara confessed, "but I knew that scream. It was full of panic and fear. And I wish I had. I wish I had done something then." "Thank you, Miss Thompson. I have no further questions," the prosecutor concluded, stepping back. The defense attorney rose, a slight smirk on his face. "Miss Thompson, might I remind you that memories can be distorted? You've admitted that you didn't witness anything firsthand. Could it be that your anxiety led you to misconstrue the events that night?" Clara straightened, her courage igniting. "Oh, I know what I heard. I lived with that scream every day. I felt the fear that overtook the room. Richard tried to manipulate me, just like he manipulated everyone else." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, visibly agitated. For a fleeting moment, Sarah thought she could see the chinks in his armor, but the defense attorney persisted. "Isn't it true that you and the victim had a disagreement just prior to the incident? Perhaps that colored your perception? Maybe we argued, but it didn't mean that I wanted her gone." Clara retorted, her voice rising. "I was her friend, and I should have protected her. That's what friends do." With newfound resolve, Clara continued to answer questions, each one peeling back layers of deceit like an onion. The courtroom was wrapped, hanging on her every word. Sarah watched her transform from a frightened girl into someone willing to confront their demons, fueled by the desire for redemption. After Clara's testimony concluded and she returned to her seat beside Sarah, there was a palpable shift in the courtroom. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air, crystallizing in the minds of everyone present. The prosecutor remarked, "Your Honor, with the witness's testimony, I request the court allow a review of digital evidence, specifically cell phone records from that night. Richard Calloway's connections to this case must be scrutinized." The judge nodded, and the gavel struck again. "This court will adjourn for a short recess. We will return to view the evidence presented before us." As the gavel fell, Sarah turned to Clara. "You were incredible. I know that wasn't easy." "I couldn't have done it without your support," Clara replied, her eyes bright with tears. "I can't change what happened, but I can help us move forward. As the courtroom emptied for the break, Sarah felt a shift within herself. This was more than just a quest for closure. It was about empowerment. It was about truth rising in the face of power, about pushing back against the tides of silence that had swept away so many lives. Together, they had opened a door, and with it, the promise of justice. But Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. Richard's arrogance wouldn't go unchallenged, and the coming battles would be fierce. But fortified by friendship and the urgency of their mission, Sarah and Clara were prepared to face whatever darkness lay ahead. With purpose in her heart, Sarah scanned the courtroom, her eyes landing on Richard. He was upset, no longer the untouchable figure he once appeared to be. The realization washed over her. They were gaining ground, and with every step, the shadows that had haunted them would begin to unveil secrets long obscured. As the break concluded and the courtroom reconvened, Sarah felt an electric charge in the air. The tides were shifting, and as they unveiled the truths of the past, she was ready to stand tall and push the boundaries of what was right. "Let's show them what they're up against," Sarah whispered to Clara, determination burning in her soul. The battle for justice was far from over, and together, they would emerge from the darkness into the light. The courtroom buzzed as the recess came to an end. The air was thick with anticipation, the stakes higher than ever. Sarah sat beside Clara, her heart pounding in sync with the ticking clock. The gavel struck again, and the judge called the court back into session. "Are you ready to hear the digital evidence?" the judge asked, looking around the room, his gaze lingering on Richard, whose composure seemed to have slipped slightly. The prosecutor had obtained cell phone records from that fateful night, a treasure trove of text messages, calls, and location pings that could shed light on Richard's whereabouts and intentions. Sarah felt a mixture of hope and trepidation. If this evidence bore fruit, it could change everything. The prosecutor stepped forward, projecting confidence. "Your Honor, we have discovered several messages sent and received by Mr. Calloway on the night of the incident. I would like to present them as evidence." A series of images appeared on the courtroom monitors, displaying messages that had been exchanged during the hours surrounding the party. A hush fell over the room as everyone leaned in to read the text messages streamed down the screen. "You can be mine tonight," the prosecutor read aloud, voice steady. This was sent by Richard to Sarah's sister shortly before she disappeared. "My next question is, what was his intention?" Richard straightened, a mask of arrogance slipping back over his features. "Context matters, Your Honor. Words can be misconstrued. I'm an innocent man being targeted." But the prosecutor continued, unbothered. Further messages indicate a series of conversations where the victim expressed her desire to leave, to be with friends. Yet the responses she received went as follows: "Just stay a little longer. The night is young." Gasps filled the courtroom. Even Richard's arrogance faltered momentarily. It was becoming clear that he had actively sought to manipulate the situation and the victim. "Your Honor," the prosecutor pressed on, "I also have testimony from witnesses who reported seeing Richard lead Sarah's sister to a secluded area, despite her insistence that she wanted to leave. This was corroborated by cell phone data, matching the time and location." With every word, the atmosphere shifted. Richard's face grew pale as the evidence piled against him, like a weight threatening to crush any doubts lingering in the minds of the jurors. "It is my belief," the prosecutor concluded, "that Richard Calloway used coercive tactics to lure Sarah's sister into a dangerous situation, and I ask for the court to consider these facts in determining his culpability." With the evidence unveiled, Sarah glanced at Clara, who was wide-eyed, processing the monumental shift in the case. Clara reached for Sarah's hand, squeezing it tightly, a shared understanding passing between them. Justice was within reach. Richard's defense attorney sprung up again, his voice cutting through the mounting tension. "Your Honor, while these messages may seem damning, they lack indirect evidence of wrongdoing. I implore the jury to remain cautious about jumping to conclusions without the complete context." But the damage was done. The prosecutor had expertly guided the narrative, weaving a heartbreaking tapestry of manipulation and control. The courtroom buzzed with suspicion toward Richard, a collective realization forming that they had been witnessing layers of deceit unraveling right before their eyes. When the defense finished, the judge called for a recess once more. Sarah's heart raced. This was the moment that would determine the future for her sister and the truth that needed to be told. Back in the hallway, Sarah and Clara found a quiet spot away from the throng of attorneys and spectators. Clara's hands shook as she confronted the whirlwind of emotions. What if he gets away with this? What if the jury doesn't believe us? He will be held accountable, Sarah reassured, holding Clara's gaze. You found your voice today, and what we're doing matters. Truth has a way of surfacing, and nothing can silence it forever. Clara nodded, but doubt lingered in her eyes. Still, Richard will try to manipulate the jury. He'll twist everything to protect himself. Let's not focus on what he might do, Sarah countered. Instead, let's speak to the courage in our hearts, the kind that dares to challenge abusers. We owe it to my sister, to your courage. No more silence. As the recess ended and the jury returned, Sarah felt a hopeful excitement coursing through her veins. The judge resumed order, and Sarah took her seat with Clara, ready for the final showdown. Will the jury please deliver their verdict? The judge asked, peering at the foreperson. With the entire courtroom holding its breath, the foreperson stood. We, the jury, find the defendant, Richard Calloway, guilty of wrongful conduct leading to the injury of Sarah Thompson. Cheers erupted from the gallery, and tears streamed down Clara's face. Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders as her heart soared. Justice had been served, not just for her sister, but for all the voices silenced by fear and manipulation. As Richard's confident facade crumbled under the weight of the jury's decision, he was led away by the deputies, his expression a mix of disbelief and fury, his power now stripped away. In the aftermath, as Clara and Sarah embraced, laughter and tears mingled with joy and relief. They had fought for justice, reclaiming what had been lost for so long. Thank you for believing in me, Clara whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I knew it was time to speak up. With your courage, we forged a new path, Sarah replied, her heart full. Now, we take this moment to honor my sister and all those who suffered in silence. As they stepped out of the courtroom, the sun shone brightly above them, illuminating their path forward. Finally, the shadows that had haunted them began to dissipate, replaced by the light of truth. Together, Sarah and Clara walked into their new chapter, one filled with hope, empowered by the courage to face whatever challenges lay ahead. They would continue to speak out, raise awareness, and advocate for those who felt voiceless. Their journey had begun, but it was only the beginning, the first step toward healing the wounds of the past and ensuring that the future was brighter for those who needed it the most. And so, hand in hand, they stepped into the world, ready to make a difference. And thus concludes the story. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you have any other requests or themes in mind, let me know.